recruitment, they're going to communicate with the child excessively. So they're going to be calling them and emailing them and texting them and trying to establish themselves as the primary source of social influence in their lives. And continuing with recruiting. And then also, you know, they're going to make them feel very grown up and older than they are, because keep in mind, again, these are young girls and boys, you know, 12 to 14 years old. So once they start to have that relationship and build that trust, they're going to try to begin to touch them inappropriately, talk inappropriately, you know, take pictures and videos of them, and begin to make alcohol and drugs available to them. And then once they've recruited them, they start the manipulation phase, and that's when they're going to be constantly monitoring this child. They're going to isolate them, try to keep them away from other children, keep them away from their family. They may support them financially, and then, you know, if the child wants to run away, they're going to say, I can provide you a shelter, you know, I can provide you a home. So they're really stepping into that primary caregiver role of the child. And you know, they'll tell them that they love them so much they can't survive without them, and then they'll start, again, introducing pornography into the relationship, start to try and normalize sexual behavior, desensitize them through physical contact. So in 1943, there was a psychologist named Abraham Maslow. And Maslow developed the hierarchy of needs. And basically what this is, from a psychological perspective, is from the bottom up is all human needs. So when a trafficker is manipulating a victim, what he tries to do is meet all of these needs. So on the bottom, going across, you have the physiological needs. So he's going to provide food, water, shelter, clothing, and then safety. And often these children are from abusive homes, so he's going to be playing the protector role, provide them safety, financial security, and then love and belonging, obviously the adoration, and then building up their esteem with compliments and flattery and gifts. And then the self-actualization is basically your hopes and dreams. So a lot of these girls, and in the memoirs that I read, they just want to be married and have a family. You know, they want the little white picket fence, little American dream house. And so this perpetrator will say, well, I'll marry you someday, we'll have that, we'll have all that someday, we'll have family. And they're so needy, in need of love and affirmation, that they just so easily manipulated into this with everything else that they're doing psychologically, because perpetrators are experts at manipulating these children. So they'll identify the child's needs, fulfill it, and then remove any other sources of fulfillment, and then exploit the child's dependence for this need by forcing them into becoming trafficked. So when they're exploiting a victim, what they do, once the trafficker thinks that this child is bonded to them, they will do what they call turn them out. So they'll turn them out and start selling them for sex. And this is really the stage when the perpetrator gains complete control over the victim, both mind and body. So he will verbally and physically abuse the child, might get her addicted to alcohol and drugs, alienate that child. Sometimes the child's only contact is the perpetrator. And again, every situation is different. This, you know, could be in the case of a runaway who has nowhere else to go and no family. But some pimps will have a stable, what they call a stable, which means a few girls living together, and they call them wives-in-law. So the child might have interaction with other young girls that he's controlling, but he manipulates all of the girls and pits them against each other so that the girls ultimately have full allegiance to him. He doesn't want them to have friendships with each other. He wants them to do whatever he says, so he does not permit that. So really, the perpetrator is treating the child as property. And you'll see some of the tattoos here. He'll brand his victims with his mark. Some of the tattoos, it just is so upsetting to see that, you know, this poor girl has a tattoo that says loyalty on her face. They brand them with IPC numbers, with their names. And they'll convince the child that the authorities are bad guys. They'll say, they aren't going to care what you say, they won't believe you, the police are corrupt, I have connections with the police, or that the victim will be arrested. And then they'll also tell them that, you know, if you try to escape, I'm going to hurt your friends and family. and threaten that violence. So a day in the life of a youth that's being sex trafficked would go something like this. Again, every situation is different. But they often work long hours, overnight, being sold for sex. They're often beaten and raped by Johns. They are average, what they say is they're sold 10 to 30 times a day. They need to meet a quota or they're beaten. Often that quota is $1,000 to $1,500. If they don't meet the quota, the pimp will send them back out or tell them they have to go work elsewhere. Obviously the pimp takes all the money, and their lives are really filled with violence, and a lot of them become suicidal. So this was written by a survivor, and I think this really reiterates what Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid shows. And she's saying about her perpetrator, her pimp, you will do anything to feel like he's everything, and he promises you everything. And the things he convinces you to do, they don't seem that bad if afterwards he shows you how much he loves you. And as long as your profits meet expectations, you will have what you've always wanted your whole life, love. As I mentioned before, it's extremely hard for people to leave the life, what they call the life, being sex trafficked. Victims suffer from devastating physical, mental, and emotional drama. They're trapped by fear and shame. They're often addicted to drugs. In Wisconsin, there's a huge heroin problem. And even though their quality of life is terrible, they're still completely connected to their trafficker through what's called a trauma bond or Stockholm syndrome. So traffickers are experts at establishing this trauma bond. Essentially what that is although the victim is subjected to cycles of violence, the trafficker will interrupt those cycles of violence with something positive, like love or gifts or a date, something like that, usually something kind, acts of kindness. And the victim is kept as much as possible from other human contact, so the victim doesn't have that other perspective, the other human perspective to know what's right and wrong, and they feel that there's no way they can escape their situation. So victims will bond to their traffickers, and they don't realize this, but psychologically, that emotional bonding to their captor is actually a psychological strategy for survival. And if they do survive and escape, that trauma bond is also incredibly difficult to reprogram their minds and heal from that trauma bond. So why they can't leave. On top of the trauma bond, victim's emotional state tells her that she is the one at fault. She does not deserve a better life. A lot of victims don't even think that they're victims. They don't have self-worth. They don't have reason for hope. And those attitudes and core beliefs are so distorted, it's as if they're living in a cult and their minds need to be reprogrammed. It's very complex. One of the memoirs that I read that I absolutely love, is up there, is Girls Like Us. And it's written by Rachel Lloyd. She's a survivor of sex trafficking, and she runs a program in New York City called GEMS, which is Girls Education and Mentoring Services. And that's a survivor-led program. It's very successful to have survivors involved in the healing process for victims. But there's an excerpt from the book about her pimp that I thought was so poignant and says so much about the relationship between victim and pimp. I know that he knows everything about me, past, present, and future. I know that he is all-powerful, all-knowing, and no matter where I go, he is there. Even when I run away, he finds me, and he either punishes me or cajoles me into forgiving him. He feels like a part of my skin. He's in my bloodstream. When he tells me that even if I get married, have children, I'm gone for 10 years, he'll find me, I believe him. When he says that I have no choice but to go with him, that I'll always belong to him, that I was born to be his, I believe him. Okay, so signs of a victim. Let's just talk about how to identify victims. And this is also the little red flags business card that you have in front of you, summarizes these. And I do have extra handouts and extra business cards up here. My personal business card too, if you want my email, my phone number. But a lot of those handouts that you can use, you can take anything that's up here except the books, those are mine. But signs that a victim is a child is a victim of sex trafficking, obviously physical, sexual abuse, restraint, confinement, not free to come and go as she wishes, often has a much older boyfriend, that's a huge red flag. She could carry multiple hotel key cards, IDs. She might have a sudden increase in expensive stuff. She might be dressing differently, have extra cell phones. She might be constantly late or absent from school. She appears disconnected. She's starting to step back from her family and her friends, teachers, changes in her behavior, her attire, her attitude. She may be inappropriately dressed or coached on what to say. She doesn't have control over her schedule, and she might show signs of exhaustion and fear. And this PowerPoint version kind of reformatted mine, so the one, if I email it to you, you'll be able to read everything there for you. And then labor trafficking, signs of a victim of labor trafficking. Often they're going to be malnourished. They're not going to want to talk to people. Again, they may not speak the language. They may not speak at all. They can't identify where they live. They may live with multiple people. They don't have any ID or any money. They are often accompanied by a third party who's often talking for them. They have unmet medical needs. And again, we don't often see those poor people. So I think one of the most powerful ways to really understand what's happening with human trafficking and to really have some key takeaways in your mind is to hear actual real life stories of survivors. I would encourage you to search for sex trafficking survivor story on YouTube. There's quite a few videos that are out there. There's quite a few memoirs. But I recently attended a progress update meeting for the Allegheny County Human Trafficking Task Force. And one of the stories that they talked about was the story that was in the Green Bay Press Gazette 2 years ago, well, about a year and a half ago. And the police officer there told us about Paige. And Paige is the 14-year-old girl who's part of this story. He started working with her when she was 14 because they staged a raid it was up at the Motel 6 by the Fox River Mall in Appleton. Her pimp was selling her and a 17-year-old girl for sex out of their motel room. And they arrested the pimp and they rescued these two girls. When they got there, Paige was 14, and she said she had been sold to 18 men before they got there at the hotel, and she needed money to pay her pimp because he had threatened her. And she was with another girl from Green Bay who was 17 years old, and she was addicted to heroin at the time. The pimp had got her addicted to heroin. And I remember the police officer said that it was such a sad situation because the entire time they were there, he watched the pimp and the pimp watched Paige. And he said it was like he was staring into her soul. He did not take his eyes off of Paige the entire time. And I don't know if he actually got arrested. I doubt he got convicted, but it was just a very sad situation. So he started working with Paige then, and he's been working with her for 2 years now, almost. And they were able to get her into a rehab program and a rescue home, and then she ran away back to her pimp. And then it happened again. She got into trouble. She got in trouble at school. She has a broken family life. And 3 times they've rescued her, and she's run back to her pimp. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is often the case. It's very, very hard for them to leave the life. They are so psychologically bonded to their traffickers. The average number of times that they will escape or try to get out of the life is 6 before they actually are able to get out of the life. So this is a video that just shows you a couple real-life examples. Take my formatting, so I'm just going to go to YouTube to show you. This was on Oprah Winfrey, I think, 2 or 3 months ago.
We do 2 things at More to Life, and you guys know that. It's victim services and prevention. And victim service is all the trauma-informed care and the aftercare and all these activities and stuff you guys do and need to heal. I know Don and Emily want to hear what you really have to say.
There's someone out there that doesn't get the opportunity to hear the message. We all have a story to tell, but we're afraid sometimes to tell it.
I started being sexually abused when I was a child, at the age of 7, until I was 14. After that, I kind of just checked out on life. You know, I mean, I was confused, I was hurt, I was lost. I didn't understand why it happened or, you know, how to fix it. I got involved in drugs and, you know, kind of self-medicated. When I was 17, I met my first trafficker, whatever you want to call them.
I was molested when I was 3 years old. I finally told somebody when I was 8 years old. We're here, we're strong women, and we can strive to get a life, and I'm a survivor.
My trafficker, I was actually with for 6 years, and at first, he was my boyfriend and never put his hands on me for the first 2 years. Like, a lot of these girls that are being trafficked don't realize that that's what it is, because I didn't until I got here. I just thought I was a prostitute and he was my boyfriend, but that's not the case, and I just want girls to know that that's not love. And I was able, thanks to Dr. Bello and Mr. Derek and More to Life, to get a chance at a new life, like just a new start.
Hi, YouTubers. I'm excited to give you
Okay. So those are some real life examples. Let's talk about the demand. Sorry that the formatting. The pictures of a gentleman from Verona, which is outside of Madison, who tried to purchase a girl online, an 8-year-old girl online for $50 for sex. So he's an example of a John. What they call sex buyers, they call them Johns or buyers. There's been little research done on the demographics of sex buyers. There were a couple studies. There was one done in Chicago that found about 40% of buyers were African American, 36% were white, and the remaining were other races. 53% were regular purchasers. And then there was another study in Minneapolis that did some demographic information. It said that majority of sex buyers were college-educated married men between the ages of 30 and 49. And 67% were white and 66% had children. Buyers come from every socioeconomic status in our society. And a lot of the Johns have in their mindset that the girls want this, which is not true. Another study reports that 83% of the buyers say they are addicted to sex. And where do they buy sex? So up until a few months ago, Backpage.com was the #1 way. Backpage.com, the federal government forced them to shut down their escort section of the website. And that's a very proactive, positive measure. We'll see how that impacts the purchasing. However, they've already gone to some other sections of Backpage.com, some other categories, and they're kind of doing hidden ads now. Craigslist, other online outlets, there's apps that they can use. I mean, essentially all they have to do is get a hold of a pimp's phone number and they'll be able to purchase sex. Now, arrest and prosecution of Johns are rare. I think I read somewhere that it's like 99% of Johns, there's nothing ever done to them. But they are feeding the demand and something should be done about that. And punishments are pretty lenient, but they're working on that, and things are improving. I went up to the Outagamie County Progress Update meeting, and what they're doing now is they actually they'll do stings, and then they'll arrest the John, they'll fine them $1,200, put them on probation for a year, and then they also are required to attend what's called a John School, which is a half-day seminar that basically shares with them information about what this really is, which is sex trafficking, and how these girls do not want to be involved in this life, and how they're manipulated and how they're treated. And they've had really positive response to that. They haven't had any repeat offenders, which is very good. So it's kind of a proactive measure. And really in Wisconsin, we are increasing awareness tremendously. This was last year, the Attorney General, Brad Schimmel, he said, here's the message to all Johns, we're coming for you. We are going to educate law enforcement in every area of the state. So that was a really exciting message. I'm going to speed up just a little bit to be on time for you here. So international legislation, there's 2 pieces of international legislation, the Universal Declaration of Rights and the Palermo Convention. I'm not going to go into detail because I want to keep this presentation going and be respectful of everyone's time. Federal legislation, there's 5. There's the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, the Mann Act, the Traffic Victims Protection Act in 2000, which was monumental in setting a lot of legislation across the United States. And then just 3 years ago, the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act. And then just last year, we had the End Modern Slavery Initiative. So there is legislation being done. In Wisconsin, we have two pretty strong human trafficking statutes, which are the human trafficking and then the trafficking of a child statute. And then we also have Wisconsin Act 367, and that was signed into law last year. That requires agencies to report children used for sex trafficking or prostitution as victims. If a child is under 18, they are not a prostitute, they are a victim. A lot of the women who are arrested who are 18 and over are victims. They are not prostitutes. So they're trying to at least change that terminology in reference to children. From those two statutes, Wisconsin defines the crimes very well, and they do carry felony punishments and pretty significant monetary fines as well. Most of them are sentences of 20 to 40 years, $100,000 fine. The problem is finding and prosecuting the traffickers. So even though we have great legislation and the crimes are defined and the punishments are strong, we've only had, I think it's around a dozen successful convictions of traffickers in Wisconsin, all time. So it's really pitiful. But there's been a lot more attention paid to it in the last few years. These are 3 successful convictions in Wisconsin. The guy on the left, these are all pimps. The guy on the left is Wausau, Middle, Sparta, and on the right is Milwaukee. This is all across the state. The guy on the left was the first case in Wisconsin ever prosecuted, and that was in March of 2012. And then the one in the middle was 2016, and then he was just 2016. His sentencing is coming through this month, actually. So they are starting to prosecute, but again, it's very difficult. And it's extremely difficult to get the victims to testify against their trafficker because they have that trauma bond. So, spreading awareness, again, good news from Wisconsin, there are a lot of task forces. These are mostly composed of professionals, so you're gonna have educators, law enforcement officials, justice system representatives. There's quite a few, some statewide, some countywide, and then also the FBI Operation Cross Country. This happens every year, and last year was its 10th year. In 3 days, they rescued 82 minors. They arrested 239 traffickers and their associates. This is United States wide, but it takes considerable effort. They had 55 field offices involved, 74 task forces, 400 plus law enforcement agencies, and also more than 100 victim specialists on the ground right there ready to respond with crisis intervention for the victims, which we will talk about in just a second and why that is so absolutely critical. I'm going to go through this as just another I'm going to talk about the chart now. Every one of you has a copy of the chart, and this is basically an overview of how a victim would get out of the life. So if you start at the left with the at-risk youth circle, kind of that yellow-orange, that's the start. So you're starting with a young person, and you can see around them they have influences. They have their parents and their family, they have their educators, and then below they have the perpetrators in red, who may come into contact with them. So if parents, family, educators, all of the influences around them can help support them, you're going to have stable youth, which is the green. If the perpetrators can get to them by the methods that we discussed already, they're targeted, they're groomed, they're manipulated, they can become an exploited victim, and that's off to the right. And then you can also see the general public, and we'll talk about some of these items here, up in the top left circle there, things that the general public can do to support those youth. But if they become an exploited victim, nearly all the time, again, every situation is different, but nearly all the time, you're going to need a crisis event to have that victim go through to the service system, to break through the trafficker, because the trafficker is blocking them from ever getting home. So the crisis event is often a health crisis, it's an arrest, detention, or it's a sting, the FBI sting, the local police sting, and they remove them. They escape, they're rescued, or they're arrested. They break through the trafficker, and then they're going to enter the service system at one of those points in the blue circles to the right. And it's difficult for them. It's difficult for everyone. I mean, there's really such a huge infrastructure that needs to be in place to help these victims because they have very complex needs. So maybe they come in through a medical facility. What they're recommending from hundreds of articles that I reviewed is that they need immediate crisis counseling because these victims are so traumatized If they're interrogated by a police officer, right away after being arrested, that can re-traumatize them. And they have these early interviews and they're talking and they're being re-traumatized, and this is causing anxiety, and that's another reason that they'll run right back to their trafficker, because they feel safe, they feel protected, that's their familiarity, that's their life that they know. So it's critical to have some form of immediate crisis counseling to prevent those victims from running the second that they interact with the service system. So they come in, they get immediate crisis counseling, they go through one of these points of entry, and then they get through so the immediate crisis counseling is the number one thing they need. The second thing they need is safe housing. And there's a huge lack of that across the United States. There's a lot of things being done, and I'll talk about that, but that would be the second thing. And I'm going to go back to that chart. So crisis intervention, I think I've already talked through that. They need to feel safe. They need somewhere to go where they can heal. They need to be protected from their traffickers. They need a stable environment with a myriad of services that addresses their complex need. So they need individualized services, trauma-informed, culturally sensitive, age-appropriate, and also the option to stay long-term, because a lot of these victims are going to need some time to heal. And then, let me see, so I was very excited, one of the organizations we work with is I Heart World up in Green Bay, and they're opening a safe house this year in Brown County. It's called the Rose House. They're a phenomenal organization. There are a couple safe houses in the Milwaukee area. There's the Restore Innocence Ranch, Grateful Girls Safe Haven. The Sisters Program South Collaborative is working on a safe house in South Milwaukee too. Exploit No More Milwaukee is opening a Freedom House this year, and the Redeem and Restore Center, which is in southeastern Wisconsin, is opening a safe house. So there's a lot being done right now. But there are also, and for years, sexual assault crisis centers and youth homeless shelters have helped these victims, and thank God they have, because they've had nowhere else to go. However, a lot of those organizations don't have the specific training to meet the complex needs of human trafficking victims. But they've made an amazing impact being able to help them as much as they have. For example, Nicole, who you saw, there was nowhere for her to go, so they sent her to Harbor House in Appleton. So domestic abuse shelter, and that's how she got out of life. So as I mentioned, they need a wide range of services. So they're going to need, Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid. They need food, water, shelter, clothing, basic needs, medical services for abuse, STDs, pregnancies, counseling for a full range of mental health issues. Mentoring is huge. If there are survivors that can be mentors, play the role of mentors, that is tremendously huge for them, because that is so critical to have friends, someone who understands, someone who shows them that they can have a better life, who helps guide them with that emotional support to healing. That mentoring is absolutely critical. And then, substance abuse rehabilitation, spiritual guidance, may need childcare, skills training for re-entry into the workplace. So really, a multi-tiered collaborative response is what is needed to help these victims get out of the life. So we need to raise awareness so the general public knows what human trafficking is and knows what they can do about it. In particular, parents and teachers to be proactive in teaching girls their self-worth, self-esteem, teaching boys it's not okay to objectify women, and then adequately educating law enforcement and the courts, enacting laws that protect victims and also uphold justice against traffickers and johns, and then providing adequate services for victims and survivors. So that's the Safe House myriad of services. So what can you do? Okay, we're doing good on time. Number one, what you're doing today right here is educating yourself and others. Really together is how we're going to make a difference. Strength in numbers. There are e-newsletters online that you can sign up for that will deliver anti-trafficking information right into your inbox. So U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking has an excellent e-newsletter. That's where I get the bulk of my information. Polaris, and there's different task forces and organizations that do that. And then following those organizations on Facebook and Twitter, different social media, blogs and things like that, attending events, sharing information in your community. Share those Facebook posts from those organizations, and then you magnify the impact of that information. And also, teachers, medical professionals, attorneys, journalists all have a unique role in that